The grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. I'm so glad you're taking a few minutes to participate in this Bible study with me. In this video, we're going to reflect on an often forgotten character in the biblical story, Ishmael, the first son of Abraham. And in particular, we'll hone in on one story about Ishmael in the book of Genesis, from chapter 21, verses 8 to 21. And we'll study that text using three tools of biblical exegesis or biblical analysis: literary analysis, cultural analysis, and historical analysis. And we don't have time to dig very deeply into any of those, and so we'll focus on just one small aspect of the story within each of those three areas. Let's start by reading the story aloud together from the Common English Bible translation. The boy grew and stopped nursing. On the day Isaac stopped nursing, Abraham prepared a huge banquet. Sarah saw Hagar's son laughing, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, "Send this servant away with her son. This servant's son won't share the inheritance with my son, Isaac." This upset Abraham terribly because the boy, Ishmael, was his son. God said to Abraham, "Don't be upset about the boy and your servant. Do everything Sarah tells you to do because your descendants will be traced through Isaac. But I will make of your servant's son a great nation too, because he is also your descendant." Abraham got up early in the morning, took some bread and a flask of water and gave it to Hagar. He put the boy in her shoulder sling and sent her away. She left and wandered through the desert near Beersheba. Finally, the water in the flask ran out, and she put the boy down under one of the desert shrubs. She walked away from him about as far as a bow shot and sat down, telling herself, "I can't bear to see the boy die." She sat at a distance, cried out in grief, and wept. God heard the boy's cries, and God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cries over there. Get up, pick up the boy and take him by the hand, because I will make of him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes and she saw a well. She went over, filled the water flask, and gave the boy a drink. God remained with the boy. He grew up, lived in the desert, and became an expert archer. He lived in the Paran desert, and his mother found him an Egyptian wife. Having listened to the passage, reflect for a few moments. What strikes you about this passage? What really stuck with you? What questions does it leave you with? What does it mean to you? And what do you think was the original meaning of the text for the audience it was written for? Feel free to pause the video for a few moments now to reflect, or even to reread the passage again at your own pace and reflect on it before moving on to the next section of the video. As we study this text to gain a deeper understanding of it, we begin with a literary analysis. And one of the aspects of a literary analysis that we can use when we're studying a biblical text is to look at the original language of the text in Hebrew or Greek, or at least compare and contrast a few English translations of it. There are more than 450 English translations of the Bible. Now, sometimes we might Google a Bible verse and just click on the first result that shows up in our search engine without paying much attention to what translation it is. Others of us may have a favorite Bible translation that we always use, the NRSV, for instance, or the NIV, or King James, or CEB. And while there's certainly nothing wrong with having a favorite translation, when we're really trying to study and understand a text more deeply, it can be helpful to look at a few different translations, because translations sometimes have pretty significant differences. That's because translating often requires interpretation. Translators are doing their best to remain faithful to the original texts and languages, but they have to make decisions that require interpretation sometimes. And the biblical scholars who translate don't always agree. So with that in mind, let's take a look at one verse from our passage in Genesis that's critical to how we understand this story. Genesis 21, verse 9. Here's what the Hebrew looks like. In the left column, you'll see the original Hebrew words with the transliteration using English characters just below the Hebrew. And in the right column, you'll see one English translation's wooden or literal translation of this verse. Now let's take a closer look at the last word in this verse, metzahek. It comes from the Hebrew root word tzakak. It's a verb, and its most basic meaning is to laugh. But here you'll see all the different English words that are used to translate this one Hebrew word in different texts throughout the Bible. And this is all from just a single English translation. Simply put, this Hebrew word tzakak has a pretty diverse range of meanings. And so there's a lot of room for interpretation by translators. So with that little bit of background on this verse in mind, I invite you now to read through 4 different English translations of Genesis 21, verse 9. And then spend a little time to look at those translations carefully, to notice any key differences between them. And spend a little time reflecting on what significance those differences might have in how you interpret and understand this story. Those 4 different translations will appear on your screen now for a few moments. Feel free to pause the video here to read through them and reflect for a few minutes before moving on to the next part of the lesson. In a cultural analysis of a biblical text, you study information about the cultural context of the biblical world. In short, cultural analysis often answers questions that are raised by the text, revealing information about the cultural norms and traditions that likely would have been obvious to the original audience of the story and needed no explanation. But to us as readers today, we need some explanation because the culture of the biblical world is foreign to us. So in this passage from Genesis 21, verses 8 to 21, I wanted to do some cultural analysis that answers some questions that we might have about heirs and inheritance after reading this passage. Questions like, who was the rightful heir of Abraham? And what lies behind Sarah's request to revoke Ishmael's inheritance? So I'll begin by saying that ancient Israel, like every other ancient Near East culture just about, was a patrilineal society, meaning that one's ancestry was traced through one's father. So in the case of Ishmael and Isaac, it was really immaterial that they had different mothers. By law, Ishmael was Abraham's son under the sole condition that Abraham recognized him as his legitimate son. And there seems to be no doubt that Abraham did indeed, as it's made clear in verse 11 of our reading today, and in other passages like Genesis chapter 17, verse 18. Now, in terms of passing down wealth in families, inheritance in ancient Israelite culture, only males received inheritance from their fathers. And among male heirs, there was a pecking order. There was the rule of primogeniture, the rights of the firstborn son. And in ancient Israel, the firstborn son was entitled to a double portion of his father's estate. Therefore, when Sarah expresses her rationale for demanding that Ishmael is sent away so that he won't share in the inheritance with my son Isaac, as she says in verse 10, she's actually demanding that Ishmael is relegated from receiving a double portion of Abraham's estate to nothing at all. It's possible, scholars say, that Sarah was even implicitly referring to a clause in the laws of Lipit Ishtar, an ancient Near East code of law, which stipulated that a man can free a slave and any children that she's borne him, and in so doing he voids the inheritance rights of any sons that were born from that relationship. So, how does understanding some of these ancient laws of patrilineal inheritance and primogeniture change the way that you understand this passage? Does it give you any additional insight into Sarah's motives for demanding that Abraham banish Ishmael? Once again, feel free to pause the video for a few moments now to reflect or discuss before moving on to the final part of the lesson. Finally, we come to our historical analysis. This is where we try to understand more about the historical setting of the story and the author who wrote it. Since biblical scholars don't really know anything definitive about the historical setting of Abraham himself, we'll focus on the historical setting of the author. And for a variety of reasons, most scholars date the writing of this story around the 9th century BCE. In other words, about 3,000 years ago. And there's near unanimous agreement among scholars that it was written in the context of the northern kingdom of Israel. You may recall from some of the history books of the Bible, books like 1st and 2nd Kings, that following King Solomon's death in 930 BCE, the people of Israel split into two distinct kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah in the south and the northern kingdom of Israel. Over the course of its turbulent 200-year history, Israel had 19 kings, beginning with Jeroboam and ending with Hoshea. Although there was considerable instability during the reigns of the first few kings of Israel, they really prospered and had their golden age, so to speak, under the rule of Ahab. And according to historical documents, it was during Ahab's reign that Israel played a significant role in a coalition of Syro-Palestinian kings that banded together to fend off the growing Assyrian Empire in the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. Israel and its allies were able to hold off Assyria in that battle, and for a long time, in fact, for a few generations. But, a little over 100 years later, by the middle of the 8th century, Assyria had just become too powerful for Israel and others to resist. And beginning with Menahem's reign, Israel began to pay tribute to the king of Assyria. Now, Israel was divided over whether to submit to Assyria and pay the tribute or to rebel, which was reflected by its subsequent kings vacillating between paying the tribute to Assyria and then refusing to do so. And when Hoshea, the last king of Israel, rebelled and refused to pay tribute, the Assyrian king finally conquered Israel by military force in 722 BCE, effectively ending Israel's monarchy. So, what does any of this have to do with the Ishmaelites? Well, historical records show that the tribes of the Ishmaelites, named after the sons of Ishmael, were largely incense traders living in the desert just south of Israel. And Assyrian historical records show that the leaders of some of those tribes of the Ishmaelites were paying tribute to the Assyrian Empire, and other leaders of those tribes were rebelling and refusing to pay tribute. Sound familiar? In other words, the Israelites and the Ishmaelites were really in the same boat. They were dealing with the same political and economic threats imposed by the growing Assyrian Empire, and they shared a common self-interest in defeating or at least minimizing the Assyrians. So, I wonder, is it possible that some of the Ishmaelite tribes were part of that same coalition of Syro-Palestinian kings that King Ahab and Israel were part of? That coalition that banded together to fight off Assyria in the 9th century. Well, a limestone tablet from 852 BCE, known as the Kirk Stela, might offer us a clue. This tablet bears the Assyrian account of the Battle of Karkar, and it lists the enemies and their numbers that were faced by the Assyrians, including, quote, 2,000 chariots, 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelite, and 1,000 camels of Gindibu the Arabian. While there were no other historical clues about the identity of Gindibu, it's certainly possible that he was a leader of the Ishmaelites at the time. And according to the ancient historian Josephus, Ishmael was known as the founder of the Arabs. And when Islam was established as a faith tradition several centuries later, Ishmael and those who descended from him, the Ishmaelites, became connected and often equated with the term Arab in Jewish and Christian literature at the time. So all this historical analysis leads us towards the possibility that at the time our story in Genesis 21 verses 8 to 21 was written, the Ishmaelites and the Israelites were friends and allies. That they, along with other nearby nations, had formed a military alliance to protect their land, their people, and their livelihood from the Assyrian Empire. So one last time, I invite you to pause for a few moments and reflect on all this new historical analysis and ponder, how does this knowledge about the historical setting of our story's author impact your understanding of this story? How does knowing that the Ishmaelites were neighbors and quite possibly military allies of the Israelites in any way change the way that you perceive the character and the fate of Ishmael in this story from Genesis? Take a few minutes to wonder about this on your own or just discuss with whoever you may be watching this with now. Finally, I'd like to give a little consideration to the interfaith aspect of this story. Christian tradition and scripture trace the genealogy of Jesus back to Abraham's second son, Isaac, most explicitly in the opening verses of the Gospel of Matthew. Muslim tradition, on the other hand, traces the lineage of the prophet Muhammad back to Abraham's first son, Ishmael. While it's important for us to acknowledge that neither Christianity nor Islam existed when the book of Genesis was written, it's indisputable that this story and others in our Holy Scriptures shape the way that we understand our relationship with other faith traditions. And so, in one sense, we, as modern readers of Genesis 21, could choose to read this story as the initial split between the Judeo-Christian and the Muslim traditions, the beginning of difference, really. But for me personally, While this story is clearly creating some distinction between the Israelites and the Ishmaelites, it's also claiming a deep connection and kinship through one Father and one God. And at its core, Genesis 21, 8-21 reveals that though they're different, God will bless, God will be present with, and God will continue to work through both the Israelites and the Ishmaelites alike. So as we close this time of study together, I invite you one last time to reflect for a few moments on the practical implications of this text for the relations between Christians, Muslims, and Jews today. Thanks for being part of this study. Blessings on you.